解决本州饥饿、贫困和营养问题的计划。Kathy Hochu 和 Lee Zenden 也有受到邀请，但他们选择不参加。这个是个快速的说明。我们提供8种语言的活动翻译，包括西班牙语、孟加拉语、普通话、粤语、海地克里奥尔语、俄语和乌尔都语。要访问这些服务，请单击屏幕底部的地球口译图标，选择并单击你的单选语言。我们将在整个活动当中提供 ASL 口译服务，你还可以选择随时启动活动的实时转录。现在是国会议员汤姆所其代表长岛第3国会选区，他既是律师又是注册会计师。他正在争夺6月初选中的民主党州长选后人提名。
Food stamps or housing choice voucher or heat assistance. Let's try and find out what brought you to this point and see what we can do with all the services that exist to actually help people and actually help solve the problems that they face.
16年来
And secondly, the other issue I'd like to talk about is related to food markets. I was down at the just campaign this past weekend at the Union Square food market, and it was farmers market. And I talked to a guy named Bob Lewis, who used to work for the Department of Agriculture. And he set up that farmers market back in the 1980s. And I remember going to that farmers market when I was living in the city. And he talked about how it can be such a win-win-win for people who need access to fresh produce, because obesity is such a problem. Food stamps often buy products that cost less money, that aren't as healthy for you. But at a farmer's stand, a farmer's market, you can get those products for cheaper. It's a win for the farmers because you're connecting the rural areas to the urban areas, and it's a win for the people overall. So let me just take any questions that you may have for me.
I wanted to start, Congressman, by talking about a quote from you from 2016. You said that if you're making $150,000 a year on Long Island, you're struggling, or Nassau County, you said you're struggling. So to be considered to be living in poverty.
现在要问的问题，要被视为包括纽约州在内的美国生活在贫困中，一个3口之家的收入，要低于21,720美元。该州的家庭收入中位数为67,046美元。2016年，有人引用你的话说，如果你在县挣了15万美元，那你就苦苦的挣扎。你还坚持这个说法吗？如果是这样，那对于在长岛收入21,720美元的人意味着什么呢？
afford to educate your children, where you can afford to retire one day. The problem is there are so many people in New York State that can't do that. They can't possibly have a place to live and have health insurance and have a retirement or pay for extra.
在纽约州，因为经济很困难，每个人收的钱都收入不是那么多，所以不是每一个人都可以得到他们需要的。
By the landlords. We have some of the highest utility rates in the country that are going up every day. And we have the national problem related to just basic food costs and inflation for gas prices and everyday staples. So there are a lot of people suffering regularly. And I've devoted a big part of my life to trying to help lift people up out of poverty.
Let me follow up with a related question, Congressman. The minimum wage in New York City, Long Island, and Westchester, the lower part of the state here, it's $15 an hour. In the rest of upstate New York, it's currently $13.20 an hour. Unless you're a fast food worker, they get $15 an hour. So I guess it's really a three-part question. Considering the cost of living in New York, what do you consider to be a living wage? Would you support an immediate increase in the upstate minimum so that other workers are getting at least as much as fast food workers? And do you support indexing the minimum wage to include a cost of living adjustment?
Yes, I do. The challenge is
在
that
纽
we
约的收入，你觉得什么样的收入才是算一个是正常的收
wage
入？
of $7.25 an hour. To put that in perspective, if you make $10 an hour and you work 40 hours a week and you work 50 weeks a year, that's only $20,000 a year. You
如
can't
果一
find
个人收入是10块钱的话，那做工作40个钟，
in New York State making $20,000 a
52
year.
个星期，那他们只有挣到2万块的钱，
$30,000 a year.
或者是15块钱一个钟，那就是3万块钱一年。
But really throughout the state. And I do support the idea of increasing people's wages, but we have to recognize that people are
汤姆
leaving
说他赞成要
because the cost of living
增长我们的
So we have to
时
figure
钟
out
薪水。
how can we balance our desire to serve the people that live here in New York against the
那现在
competition.
问题就是说，那我们要怎么样才可以解决这个问
That's
题？
why federal policy is so important on these issues.
所以说，联邦政府的政策是很重要的。
Minimum wage, national policy related to taxes.
在一个国家，
I'm a big supporter of increasing taxes at the federal level.
在一个国家的制度来说，
Increase the taxes at the federal
联
level.
邦
The
的
problem is, if we increase
1个
the
小
taxes
时
in New York
的
State,
钟的
then
价钱
we
是很
have
重要的。
people continuing to leave our state because they can't afford to live here. It's a very tough balance. One of the reasons I'm running for governor is so I can have a national voice on these issues that are so important.
Would a higher wage, in your opinion, would it drive jobs out of the state, or would it attract workers to this state from some of those low-wage neighbors that you were talking about?
Well, the big challenge that we're facing is that when you increase the wages, you also increase the cost of government. You increase a lot of the services. Now you want people to have a living wage. We just went through this whole debate with childcare, where we increased the wages of childcare workers. The state wouldn't give the advocates as much money as they were requesting, which they felt was necessary for childcare workers to have a living wage. The advocates are really upset. They're really angry about the fact that they didn't get nearly what they were seeking. The problem is that the state is already the highest tax state in the United States of America. I believe that we have to go after the waste, fraud, and abuse where we have in Medicaid, for example, 2.5 times the cost of the national average, bigger than Florida and Texas combined. Florida and Texas are both bigger than New York. We have 2.5 times the cost of the national average. We spend more on Medicaid than those two states combined, even though they're bigger than we are. We spend more per student than any state in the United States of America, but our education results are not better than the rest of the state. So there's always a balance between these different things. How can we serve our people within our state while keeping us competitive, that people aren't leaving our state because it's too expensive to live here? I believe to do that, we have to be willing to fight fights against the insiders, because right now we've had no competition in New York State for decades. There's a
What do you
reason we
mean
have the highest
insiders?
taxes in America. There's a reason that we have people leaving our state in droves. There's a reason we have a rising crime rate. It's all tied to the corruption of our state, the most corrupt state in the United States of America. We have to be willing to fight. When I was a Nassau County executive, I fought the police union, even though I support the cops, but I fought the police union because they have the highest wages they had at the time, the highest wages of any law enforcement in the country. But I fought them so I could take that savings and plow it into health and human services. We need to be doing that in New York State, where we fight some of these insider groups that control the budget of the state and fight to help the folks that are suffering the most. I've got a
So-
record of doing that.
Congressman, I just want to clarify. Errol asked if you would support indexing the minimum wage to
Yes,
include a
yes.
cost of living
另外，我
adjustment.
们就是想问你，是否将支持最低工资指化数，以包括生活成本调整，以确保它与通胀膨胀保持同步？我们知道这是一个重大的问题。 大约1/3的纽约州选民生活在贫困之中或接近贫困，年收入不超过5万块美元。自大流行开始以来，买不起足够的食物的纽约人数增加了1倍多。大约1/4的美国居民，既是450万纽约人面临食物困难。作为州长，你将采取哪些具体的措施来减少贫困和饥饿，并增加营养？
So, the poverty rate, which I think it's $27,000. In some places in the country, you're a lot better off than you are in New York because it's so expensive to live here. So we have to figure out how to work on affordability generally in New York State, especially with regressive costs like utility rates, gas prices.
我们要看我们的日常生活的用品的价钱跟其他的东西。
We also have to lift up people's wages in the private sector by encouraging unions. We've created enormous wealth in the United States of America and in New York State since the end of the 1980s. The Dow Jones has gone up 1,900%. The GDP has gone up 1,000% since the end of the 1980s. But workers' wages have gone up less than 20%. That's directly tied to the diminution of unions throughout the country. That's why I'm the chair of the Labor Caucus in Congress. I'm a very big supporter of the efforts to organize that we see taking place with Starbucks and Amazon and other profitable companies that are making tremendous amounts of wealth, but they're not sharing it with the people who go to work every day.
Now, some people don't go to work every day and they are on public assistance. Would you commit to indexing public assistance benefits to inflation to meet the increased cost of living expenses?
Yes, but we have to come up with the money. To come up with the money, we have to be willing to fight the corruption and the insiders of New York State that currently exist. I'm the only candidate in this race that's a proven executive, as a former CPA and attorney, former mayor, former county executive, who has fought against corruption my entire career. I started a thing called fixalbany.com that Errol's well aware of back in the 2000s, where I took on Shelley Silver and Joe Bruno and the state legislature to try and root out waste, fraud, and abuse and corruption in New York State, especially in the area of Medicaid. But we got a long way to go.
I'm old enough to remember that. So will you also commit, and then I'm going to throw it back to Errol, to supporting universal school meals in public schools?
Yes, and we have to consider creating meals that are kosher and halal as well in the schools. And that also we have to take the lead from Mayor Adams and look at creating much more healthy meals in schools so that kids learn good eating habits at a young age. Everything is about children at a young age. My Health and Human Services idea, my No Wrong Door idea, one of the most important things that I want to do, the most passionate thing I have in my agenda, is to bring Health and Human Services into our schools. Because as Bishop Desmond Tutu used to say, and Eric Adams uses this quote often, we spent a lifetime pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and stop people from falling in the river in the first place. We must help children in schools get the health and human services they need at a young age, because it's better to educate a child instead of paying for a jail cell later on. Everybody claps for that speech, but it doesn't happen. Why? Because most politicians don't know how to run things. I know how to run things and get things done, and I've got the heart to help the people and to fight on their behalf.
Congressman, you have called for tax cuts. If you reduce state revenue, wouldn't that make it harder and put pressure on your ability to provide programs to low-income New Yorkers like you just described?
There's no question it'll be harder, but it's a fight we have to have. We have to change the culture of New York State. People are leaving our state in droves because they can't afford to live here. Not only low-income, impoverished people, but middle-class people and wealthy people. They're leaving our state. When I was born, there were 45 members of Congress from New York State. I was born in 1962. I'm much older than the two of you are. And today, we don't have 45 members of Congress. We have 27 members of Congress, and we're going down to 26 in January 1st of 2023. We are losing influence in the state. When we lose influence, we lose access to bringing more money back from the federal government to the state of New York. We have to reduce the cost here.
So Nourish New York, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but it's a program in which food banks.
Nourish 纽约是一项向食品和提供资金以及从农民那里购买食品的计划。它现在有一个预算钱，大概是5万块钱，而且它现在非常的成功。你是否会承诺每年为这个计划提供资金
？To about 33,000 farmers today. The number of acres that we actually use for farming has been cut in less than half during that same period of time. I actually created farms in Nassau County, if you can imagine, when I was county executive, organic farms that were cooperatives on county property run by private sector folks that are still in existence 20 years later. We have to create more farms, and we have to create more connection between the farmers and the schools and urban areas, and we need to create marketplaces where there's a place for people to buy fresh, healthy produce and goods. That's a big initiative. You know, the mayor talked about investing money in Hunts Point, which is a great idea for wholesale, but we need to be doing it on a retail level and trying to encourage more farmers markets, more access to retail produce and goods from farms sourced here in New York State.
And also upstate, not just in New York City, right?
Oh, no, everywhere in the state, every single part of the state, we have to do that. And listen, obesity is a major problem. What's the leading causes of death, premature death for people? Smoking, drinking, and poor eating habits. If we want to be the healthiest state in the United States of America, we've got to address those three issues constantly and correct eating habits and access to fresh produce and healthy food is a very, very big part of that. Affordable food. And doing it at farmers markets is a very good way to do that. Bringing it into schools is a very good way to do that. Often, you know, like organic supermarkets or healthy food in supermarkets is much more expensive and not affordable for low-income people. You've got to try and make it accessible to people in retail spaces of farmers markets and available to kids in schools and in hospitals and any other institution you can. I know how to run things. I'll know how to make those connections happen.
Congressman, I want to thank you so much for your time on behalf of all of the food programs that are sponsoring this event.
Well, let me close by just saying thank you to all of your sponsors. I saw the many names that are on there, and I know that they're saving people's lives and they do great work on a regular basis. So thank you for everything that everybody does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Do we have our next candidate? Are we ready to go?
I can keep talking if you want me to.
That's all right, Tom. I'm here.
Okay. All right.
Okay, Jumani's here. All right, I love Jumani. How are you, Jumani?
Peace and blessings, Tom.
Thank you, my brother.
Okay. That voice familiar to many of you is Jumani Williams. He is the public advocate of New York City. Previously, he served on the
朱马恩是纽约市的公共倡导者。此前，他曾在代表第45市区的纽约市议会任职了9年。他现在正在争取民主党的提名。那我们现在欢迎他。我们让他来做一个自我介绍。
Hunger and anti-poverty.
Thank you so much, Errol and Susan. Peace and blessings, love and light to everyone.
Jamal Williams 是纽约市公共倡导者，之前他曾在代表45区的纽约市议会任职9年。他正在
我工作这么多年以来，我们一直在努力的争取
民主党州长候选人提名，
还有饥饿的这些问题。
Food scarcity and public safety, we never will. And one of the reasons I decided to run is because I keep hearing, you know, our leaders say we have to return to normal, and I keep saying to them that normal didn't work for most people in New York State. We've been dealing with poverty issues and hunger issues for a very long time. So I want to normalize people's lives, but I don't want to go back to normal because that's kind of.
我希望每个人的生活都回到正常的轨道。 饥饿和贫困这些问题一直是纽约市长期存在的问题。有些人可能食物不够，或者完全都没有食物。
Workers abysmal wages that have service workers struggling to make ends meet, close quote. Now, state law does allow the governor to unilaterally do this.
你的竞选网站声明，我将努力堵住允许雇主向小费工人支付让服务人员难以维持生计的糟糕工资的漏洞。那我知道州法律允许州长单方面这样做。那如果你选为了州长，你会怎么样解决这个问题呢？
But again, I always want to listen to the people who are closer to the ground. And so if people could provide some different information of how that would be more harmful, it's something that I definitely want to consider.
Well, yeah, as you may have heard, there are a lot of people who work in the hospitality industry who rely on tipped wages, and in some cases prefer it. Certain kind of gig workers, and depending on where you are, it's actually, in their opinion.
那据我们所知道的，有很多的服务行业的人员，他们都是依靠小费来支出生活的一些费用的。
So we're trying to see if there's a way that maybe it's not a one size fits all, but we do know just as there are some people that it benefits, there are some people that it harms, and so we have to try to really take a look.
我们明白这种做法可能对有一些人是有帮助的，但也有可能对有一些人是无益的。
Would you do that?
We have to index most things that have to do with how people are accessing resources. So minimum wage is one of them. And of course, as you're mentioning, making sure that people and the support that they get are also indexed. We see that everything goes up, but wages don't go up and assistance doesn't go up. You know, $15 an hour, people, sometimes look at it as a lot. Well, people laughed at us when we said we want to have minimum wage $15 an hour for people who are in fast food. But when you look at how close it actually is to the meager poverty line of this state, it doesn't really make any sense that that's where it would stay. And that just goes for assistance that people get as well. So I believe it has to be indexed to make it work.
Do you think it should be raised to $18 an hour or even higher? I mean, what is a livable wage in your opinion?
你觉得我们应该把最低工资提高到18块吗？现在纽约市已经变成全美国就是花销最大的一个地方。如果你想要住在这里的话。
That doesn't cut it, right? Even if you're making about $50,000 an hour, that won't cut it. You can see why people don't have the ability after they pay rent to make sure they eat well. We haven't even talked about medicine. We haven't talked about transportation. We haven't talked about taking.
如果我们只是考虑到他们大家赚的工资，在付完房租以后，我们还有没有足够的钱去买食物？
But it probably has to go up over $20 and it has to happen very quickly. But you would see then, once you do the math, that itself is not as much as people think. And I will add, every time we have these conversations about raising the minimum wage, we talk about how businesses are going to flee, they're going to shutter.
每次我们考虑到把最低工资提高的这个问题的时候呢，我们都要考虑到很多商家的一些很多方面。我很明白这之中有很多的一些问题，我们需要想办法去解决它。
Be at 150% of the federal poverty level in order to get the benefit.
那现在支持以最低工资生活的人们的另外一种方式是更容易获得纽约政府给的一些福利。那目前在纽约，你需要达到联邦贫困线的1% 150，但每一个州都不一样。比如说，佛蒙特州的贫困线是185%。那当家庭有资格获得这些福利的时候，你会承诺提高纽约的收入水平吗？
There are hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers who are eligible for federally funded SNAP benefits but don't receive them for one reason or another.
那纽约呢，有超过10万的居民，他们其实是有资格去领取这些福利的，但是他们很多都没有收到。那您觉得说，如果我们可以拨一些款给一些那些组织，让他们去帮助这些贫困或者说收入比较低的这些家庭去申请这些福利吗？
Government does. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of areas where these organizations do better than government when provided the proper structure and proper funding. So we absolutely should be using folks who are culturally competent and can get to spaces that many people can't, to let people know what's available to them because they simply may not know. And sometimes people may not understand it, but actually even applying for some of these things can be daunting if you're not used to interfacing with government. So 1,000%.
Let me ask you about something that comes up a lot with some of the programs that are represented here. And it's a broad sort of strategic and almost philosophical question. We've got two different kinds of food programs in New York. You have charitable and sort of retail. For
纽约有2种不同的食品计划，一种是慈善，另外一种是零售。那如果是食物银行是慈善机构，然后 SNAP 是零售的。那有一个举措是让更多的人脱离慈善事业而转向零售业。那比如说，目前学校里有食品储藏室，如果您增加了 SNAP， 也就是一种零售的模式，那福利或增加工资，那么需要这些食品储藏室的人就会减少。那我希望你能讨论一下这个问题的好处与坏处。
So if we got to a place where people were making enough money that they didn't need any of those services, it would be great. But I actually think we do need both of them. I've seen and encountered people who are doing both kind of work. During this pandemic, I think you couldn't sometimes tell whether it was a COVID test.
那在疫情期间呢，很多人其实有一些机构，他们是两种计划都有同时在做的。比如说，你现在在大马路上，每隔几条街都能看到的一些可以测试新冠的站点。那你没有办法一下子就能说明说这个到底是做慈善的还是做零售的。但是我们很需要这2种食品计划。但是因为纽约州的这个拨的款不能保证说我们一定要往哪一个食品计划发展，但是有2个都是对纽约的居民都是一个比较好的比较有用的一个好处。
And so that money is not real. It is something that you have to do in passing budgets because you can't have all the money now. But if you don't get a governor that commits to raising revenue, when we lose this federal money, some of them which is one shot, those are the first programs that are going to get cut. So it's great in an election year, but in the out years, folks are going to suffer. What I do know is that the people who are leaving are not the wealthy. They're the people who can't afford food and can't afford to live someplace. And so we have to help by lowering many of the tax rates for middle, struggling, working class. I've sued the mayor of New York City to try to balance some of that out. But in exchange for that, if we can't raise the revenue from the people who've made $200 billion a year, $200 billion after the pandemic, where are we going to get it from? So anyone that doesn't have discussion is not being honest about what New York State needs or how we're going to get it.
So you just said that the people who are leaving New York are not the wealthiest, or you said that they're more of modest means, but there is some data that would suggest that.
那你的意思是说，居住在纽约的居民并不是一些很有财富的人吗？但是您的意思是说，他们都是一些中产阶级的人，对吗？但是根据我们的一些数据表明，纽约市还是有很多一些很有财富很多的人的。
That and said that there's no evidence that millionaires and billionaires have left. I know one that's in Mar-a-Lago, he can stay there. But overall, the people who have left, we've seen, reverse migration in Black communities for several years now. The people who are leaving simply can't stay here. What I would say is this: the conversation has to be about civic responsibility. It has to be about people doing what they can with what they have where they are. If we all can't do that, then we're all going to survive, not going to survive. And I will also say, I don't want our wealthy folks to leave New York State. I don't want anyone to leave New York State. I also don't want people to live in New York State in poverty, where they can't eat.
我不想要不管是那些很有钱的人，还是说任何一个人离开纽约，但是呢，我也不想有任何一个人居住在纽约是贫困人民的。
Thank you.
I've got a rural question for you. The number of acres farmed in our state has declined dramatically over the last few decades. Do you think that's a problem?
那纽约市的一些很多农产地，在过去的几十年里面已经减少了，急剧减少了。那如果您觉得这是一个问题，你将如何扭转或者阻止这种趋势？
That we're losing farmland. I do think we have to subsidize much more of our farmers, not just so we can get farmland, but so that we can make sure people who are on those farms can get paid a wage that they can feed their families as well. Like I said, there is no way to do this that doesn't include revenue raising. Anyone who says that there is just not being honest, and is part of the reason that we got here to begin with. So we've been very clear with our transformative economy, where it is we can get this revenue raised if we have a governor that has the courage to push back on people who don't want to do it.
If you were able to raise that revenue as governor, Jumaane, do you think, how would you use it to increase the number of farmers or to help farmers who are struggling in the state?
Well, a lot of times they're struggling because they can't get enough to pay the bills, then to further farm. And we're asking more of them, rightfully so, to make sure that people have a work day that's healthy and get paid for the work they're doing. And we have to subsidize some of those. We subsidize a lot of things in the state. We subsidize market rate housing. We subsidize, we're about to subsidize another $1 billion for a stadium that does not produce the kind of economic activity that we want to see. All the economists say that. We subsidize a lot of things that are not helpful to New Yorkers, whether it's IDAs, whether it's 421A, billions and billions of dollars. We can subsidize directly to New Yorkers to provide an economy that makes sense, that helps farmers, that helps people work there, and helps the people who want to get their produce. It's important that we in-house as much as possible in this state, from food to table. It's healthy, it's doable, in so many ways beneficial to the state. That's a much better place to subsidize than, say, a Buffalo Bills stadium.
And I guess just to wrap up, let me ask you a question I'm sure you have heard on the streets. You've served in the New York City Council for nearly a decade. You've been the public advocate. And during that time, hunger and poverty have remained persistent problems. Do you think you have any responsibility for that? And is there something you wish you could have gotten your colleagues in government to do to address these problems?
I personally think we all have a responsibility, all of us that are in government. So I always include myself, and I do my best to try to push further and harder. One of the reasons, I always say, I think I have a pretty cool job as public advocate, so I'm excited about it. I don't know that I need another job. One of the reasons I'm running is something that you're touching on. I have tried to use all of the tools at my disposal, whether it's as a council member or as a public advocate, to push these issues. And I figured, you know what? Maybe I can just actually be the person that can just get it done instead of the person who's advocating and pushing. And that's one of the reasons I'm running for governor, because the questions you're asking have very legitimate and concrete answers. The things that's preventing it from happening are usually people donating to folks that want to buy policy that's harmful to most of New Yorkers, so some people can make a lot of money. And we need to have somebody who has experience pushing back on that and making government work. Because I was originally told I had to choose between being an activist and elected official. I said I don't. The best elected officials are activists. And so I'm proud when I left the council, I was listed as the most productive councilman. I'm proud as public advocate. I passed more bills than almost all the public advocates combined in just the 2 years that I've been there. And that was important to me to show that there is a model of doing politics where you are pushing back on quote unquote normal and status quo on behalf of New Yorkers and making government work. And lastly, I'll say, the party I belong to, the Democratic Party, is actually terrible talking about public safety and taxes in the economy. Those are two spaces that I'm very comfortable in, and I actually have been able to show productive, not just productive conversations, but actually produce results that have been beneficial.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. We'll wish you the best of luck, and we'll see you out on the campaign trail.
Thank you so much. Peace and blessing, love and light again. And thank you everyone who's doing God's work and making sure people are fed and living in a safe and healthy environment.
Thank you. Do we have Andrew Giuliani with us? Andrew Giuliani is our next candidate here on the forum.
I believe we were a little ahead of schedule, so he should be jumping on momentarily.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. For people who don't know, we're going to be speaking with Andrew Giuliani, and then we'll be speaking with Rob Astorino. And if you're just joining us, we're providing interpretation of this event in 8 different languages, including Spanish, Bengali, Mandarin, Cantonese, Haitian, Creole, Russian, and Urdu. And to access these services, all you need to do is click on the global interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Select and click on your preferred language. There's also some ASL interpreters. So we heard from the Democratic candidates who are joining us. Errol, anything strike you as especially interesting?
Well, yeah, it's interesting to hear people who have worked at different levels of government try to sort of hone in on what a state executive can do. So Tom Suozzi is a federal official. He's also worked at the county level. And of course, Jumaane Williams has been a city council member and a public advocate. So he's worked in local government in New York City. When you're talking about trying to sort of figure this out for this big varied state, you're talking about areas that are isolated and remote and rural, and you're talking about the heart of New York City. It is kind of difficult, I think, to sort of figure out the kind of policies that will work well in every setting from, Buffalo to Montauk. And these candidates, I think, are at the early stages of trying to iron all of that out.
Yeah, I was struck by Tom Suozzi's interest in unionization. I wasn't aware that he was such a pro-union guy, and encouraging unions is one of the things that he feels strongly about. He also spent a lot of time talking about corruption in Albany as not just in and of itself, but as something that costs taxpayer money, which is something that is absolutely the case, but we don't talk a lot about the fact that corruption costs actual dollars and cents.
Yeah, you don't hear it from Democrats so much. It tends to be coming from the other side of the aisle. when people are concerned about those kind of questions. Like he cited the oft-mentioned reality that New York has Medicaid expenses that are just completely out of line for a state of its size compared to some of our peer states. That's been true for as long as I've heard about this issue. That's like going back 25 years, you can hear people saying the same thing. And, you know, similarly, when you hear Jumaane Williams talk about how the donor class really has a lot of outsized influence in the state capitol and are essentially not quite buying legislation, but they're certainly shaping the agenda in a very aggressive way, not necessarily because it serves the public interest, but because it serves their private commercial interest. That is absolutely true. And, you know, to the extent that both candidates, I think, call it sort of small c corruption, not necessarily something you can go to jail for, but something that does twist the priorities of the legislature. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, when you look at, you know, let's just talk about the Buffalo Bills Stadium or cryptocurrency or things that really will only affect a few people. They have
特鲁吉利亚里在谈纳德特兰普总统的政府中担任公共联络办公室副主任和总统特别助理，他正在甄选共和党在6月初选中的州长提名。
Their voice at the state capitol is not quite as amplified because really they have to depend on earned media. Like this event would be considered earned media.
Sure. Well, I mean, I've heard you talk about it, what they call the Tin Cup Brigade.
Sure.
On Tuesdays during budget season. It's groups like the ones on this call. It's the groups that are doing human services, who are doing anti-poverty work, who are doing anti-hunger work, who come up and try to acquaint the legislators with their needs, with the different programmatic changes they can make, and most especially with the resource levels that are needed in order to make a dent in the problem. And it's somewhat contemptuously dismissed as, you know, oh, the Tin Cup Brigade, here they come
right,
again.
That's very not a great term to use. Yeah.
Right. And then
I've used it, but
and then of course at night they go out and have a nice, you know, steak and lobster dinner with the donors who are looking for another tax break or another variance or some other kind of legislation that, lo and behold, always seems to make it at least into the later rounds of consideration.
Yeah, we're still waiting for Andrew Giuliani. And just to make sure people understand, Andrew Giuliani is the son of the former New York City mayor. He is surprisingly, some polls, a recent Siena poll says that he's one of the most well-known candidates running for governor this round. The fact is that we haven't seen a lot of Andrew Giuliani. We've seen a lot of Rudy Giuliani, but that's his dad and, you know, the former lawyer for President Donald Trump. Andrew Giuliani also worked in the Trump administration. He was the associate director of the Office of Public Liaison and a special assistant to the president. And he worked on some interesting programs, including opioids, you know, making sure getting money to programs that address the opioid addiction problem. I believe we have Andrew Giuliani. Are you there, Andrew? I saw that he joined.
Okay.
There he is.
I am here. You see me?
Yes. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well, Susan. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you so much for joining us. I just introduced you while we were waiting for you. And I was hoping that you could just share a little bit about your background as it pertains to hunger and poverty and issues like that we're talking about tonight.
Sure. Well, I have, let me put this in right here. You know, I have been very blessed as an individual, obviously, to never have to go hungry. And frankly, I haven't had many friends that have been in and out of poverty and dealt with it. So I'm not going to lie to our audience and tell you that this is something that I've personally dealt with. What I can tell you is throughout my time in Catholic school, we spent a lot of time at food pantries. I spent this Thanksgiving, as a matter of fact, in Staten Island, giving out food. So this is something that really, I think more than anything, even less as a gubernatorial candidate, more as a Catholic, this is something that is of interest to me. So I can't say that this is something that is of deep background to me, but certainly something as somebody who cares about this state, about this city, and certainly that somebody that is a faithful follower of Christ is something that I'm focused on.
All right, so let me ask you about some policy from when your dad was mayor of New York City. At that point, a federal judge had ruled that Mayor Giuliani had violated federal law by preventing eligible city residents from obtaining federally funded food stamp benefits. I know you can't speak for what your dad did when you were a kid, but do you think that your father was correct to have done that or not?
Well, I'm honestly not aware of that policy in particular, to be perfectly honest, Susan. I mean, I can just speak to the general change that we saw in New York from the time that he got into office to when he left office. And I think we all can agree that a city that is safer, that has more jobs and more opportunities, generally means there are less hungry people there. So for me, I'm very proud of his work as mayor. I'm not in on that court case in terms of being aware of the details of it, to be perfectly honest.
Thank you.
Okay, fair enough. Andrew, it's Errol Lewis. I wanted to ask you about child poverty. It's a significant issue in New York State. In Buffalo, the child poverty rate is 44%. In Rochester, it's 48%, which is actually the highest in the nation. And in the Bronx, it's over 40%. This has been the case for decades. There doesn't seem to be an end in sight. In some cases, not much of a strategy. So with almost half of our kids living in poverty in major urban centers around the state, is it possible to have a healthy local economy? And if you agree that it is a serious problem, what policies would you put in place to address child poverty?
I think first and foremost, more than anything, I would want to make sure that we are partnering with private organizations that are leading the way on this. I don't think creating or government programs is the answer to this. I mean, the one thing that I can say that's consistent with Erie County, Monroe, and the Bronx, as you mentioned, Errol, is we've seen crime rise over the past few years. I think it's obvious that wherever we see crime rise, you're going to see continued poverty. You're going to see continued food insecurity problems. And as we all know, one of the major drivers in food insecurity and poverty is household dissolution, whether it be through divorce, whether it be through death, or whether it be through abandonment. And then the second biggest driver is job loss. So for me, that's why from our standpoint, it's making sure that New York is a place that is a job creating state, not a place where we are losing more jobs than any other state in the country. As we did over this last year, we led the country in outmigration. That's less opportunities for people. I'm also focused on making sure that we have people that are not focused on being dependent on government programs, but more focused on making sure that there are more jobs and more opportunities from government. I would look at it as, how can we partner? How can we create tax credits maybe for private philanthropies, for even businesses that are creating jobs, or from a philanthropy perspective, that are doing a good job in feeding the poor. I don't think this should be something where we are expanding a government program, to be perfectly honest.
So you're saying that instead of committing to certain government programs or funding government programs, that you would depend on the private sector to help the children in poverty that Errol was talking about. Can you give us an example of one program that a private company funds and supports that has been successful in lifting children out of poverty?
I cannot, Susan, but what I can tell you is I would focus on making sure that we look at programs and we create programs and work with the experts in this, like Joel. As I mentioned before, this is a place where I am not an expert and I don't pretend to be.
他说他不可以，他可以 他只可以看有什么一些节目或者组织，他可以叫他们去参加去组织。
Make sure that we have the experts in childhood poverty, in making sure that we are feeding our children here in New York, involved in these decision making.
我们要保证
But I would much rather see
我们会尽量去补助这些小孩的营养问题跟他的食物问题。
Private organizations to be able to do this. I don't think this is something where we should create another bureaucratic system under Albany or increase a bureaucratic system under Albany. And I don't think that's the answer.
Andrew, there's been some discussion tonight already of something that often comes up as a criticism of life in the state capitol, which is that wealthy donors, those who have financial interests, end up getting the ear of the governor, of the legislative leaders, and end up shaping the agenda, and frankly, getting a share of the public dollars and other resources that could otherwise go to deal with poverty and hunger. The recent state budget included, for example, $600 million in public funds to build a new football stadium. Do you think that kind of a project is necessary? What would you do if you were governor about those kinds of pressures from the private sector to provide public resources for things like a suburban stadium outside of Buffalo?
Well, I have certainly my concerns with that project, especially considering the governor's family, the governor's husband's connection with profiting from that, whether it be from the concessions or the lobbying contract on this. So I would love to see more information. I hope the governor will be more transparent on that. Look, as a Giant fan, I understand and get teased all the time that the Bills are the only team that actually play in New York State. So I don't want to see New York lose the Bills. That's very important as somebody who enjoys their sports and who understands the importance of sports in a community right there. But I do think in examining the new contract and examining the fact that it is remaining in Orchard Park rather than being in downtown Buffalo, I have my concerns with how many long-time jobs this is actually creating, both within the Buffalo Bills organization and obviously, in the Buffalo area. So I certainly have my concerns with the project, both considering how close the governor is to it with her husband, and then just in general for it in terms of will we actually create the kind of jobs that we think we actually should?
So, Andrew Giuliani, you mentioned that you would listen to the experts like the ones who are sponsoring this forum if you were governor. And we're lucky enough to have some of their wisdom tonight. And many of them say that they would, for example, raise the minimum wage. They would also ensure that SNAP benefits were more fully funded or make it easier for New Yorkers to obtain SNAP benefits. So that being said, how do you respond to that?
So my response is, I do not believe that raising the minimum wage is the answer to this. I think it's actually another way in which we can continue the outflow of outmigration from the state. I think we need to understand that we are competing with 50 other states. And that's the one thing. If it was just in a vacuum where you could keep people in New York no matter what, then that would be a potential option which you could do it. But that's not our country. That's not a free economy. And that's not a way where we can actually, that's viable. That's been proven to be viable. And in terms of SNAP benefits, what I would love to see is, I would love to see some tax dollars actually spent on getting people off SNAP benefits as fast as possible, whether that be through actually more unemployment, through bridging employment, I should say. But I think we all know, and we've all seen that if somebody who has been on SNAP benefits for over a year versus somebody who's been on SNAP benefits for less than 6 months, I believe the number, and correct me if I'm wrong here, and Joel, please feel free to chime in. I believe the number, if somebody has been on SNAP benefits for over a year versus less than 6 months, that person or family that's over a year is 3 times more likely to never actually not be dependent on those SNAP benefits. Is that correct?
Not sure if Joel can speak.
Since you addressed me, I've been working on this a few decades, and I've never heard that statistic before. The vast majority of SNAP recipients do come from working families, and the vast majority are working people, children, and senior citizens. The percentage of able-bodied people who just aren't employed is generally less than 10% of the caseload.
May I ask then, is there a relevant statistic that you have that shows the time on SNAP benefits versus time off of it that I could share that would be something that would, I don't want to say confirm that, but would further my education on this, as this is what I've seen.
Before the recession, the average length of time on SNAP benefits was about 8 months. Another statistic I point out, the number of Americans who are sometimes poor is 10 times the number of Americans who are always poor.
Always poor. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, you know what? I've got a related question, Andrew. There are states that that index their minimum wage so that they keep up with the rising cost of living. I understand you're skeptical about raising the minimum wage. Do you feel the same way about indexing it so that whatever the level is, at least it keeps pace with inflation?
Yes, I would explore that. And I think right now, in looking at inflation and how I wouldn't say it's out of control, but it feels certainly out of control. Obviously, as a candidate, we're traveling the state, and it's very expensive to fill up our car getting from place to place. So when you think about the type of pressures that are on each family, whether it be heating their home, whether it be actually gas, whether it be what they're seeing at the grocery store each and every day, where prices are continually 5, 10, 15% more than they were 2 years ago. That's something that I would have a conversation about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No,
So
sorry.
you've called for, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I mistakenly said that's something I would have a conversation with about, and I said, and I meant Errol, of course. So.
Okay, so you've said that you're calling for tax cuts, Andrew.
Yes.
How likely is it that if you reduce state revenue, that you would need to cut some of the very programs for low-income people that we're talking about tonight?
Well, I think there is I don't want to say perfect number, but I think there is a target number that we need to get to as a state where we're more competitive with other states. And we're, like I said, we're not leading the country in out-migration. I think we saw this, and one example that I like to use, and it's not hunger related, but certainly with the hotel tax, let's say from 1993, when it was at 23%, and in 1994, when it went down to 12%. They actually in 1994 were able to make $100,000 more off of the hotel tax. And by the time you got to 1997, it was over $1 million more from the hotel tax, specifically in New York City. So I don't think that raising taxes is the answer. And you know what? Eliminating taxes is not the answer either. But I do think right now, reducing taxes will be better from a job creator's perspective. I think we will see more people that will decide to actually stay here in New York. I know a lot of people that have decided to leave because they do not like the fact that the government is the senior partner in their relationship here in New York. And I think we don't have to look further, Susan, than the fact that New York is leading the country in out-migration, and Florida is one of those states, or Texas or Tennessee is one of those states that is actually gaining more and more people. We could just see it from the congressional districts that we've lost, if we don't even want to look past those statistics. So for me, we need to be more competitive with those states.
Real quickly, though, I hear what you're saying, but aren't there lots and lots of help wanted signs in New York right now?
Yeah.
I mean, I see them all over the place. I'm hearing about the Great Resignation. People are looking for employees. I mean, everybody is looking for employees. So if, when you talk about giving tax breaks to job creators, I get that, but there seems to be a lot of jobs available right now.
I'm not aware of jobs. Say it again. Sorry, Susan.
There are a lot of jobs available right now. And, if people need to get paid more in order. I mean, it's like it's Adam Smith, basically. You're not going to get more workers coming to your plant unless you pay them more.
Well, right now, New York City's unemployment rate is double the national average. At least that was as of 1 month ago. I'm not sure what this month's statistic is. So if that's the case, then I'm missing it. I haven't seen that, but you may be right, Susan. I just might not be looking in the right places.
Thank you. Errol, do you have another question for Andrew?
No, I think that brings us to the end of the time, actually. And I wanted to thank you for joining us, Andrew Giuliani.
Errol, Susan, Joel, thank you very much. I know on some things we may have a difference of opinion, but I really do, look forward to working with you. And I want to continue this conversation and seeing what we can do. Like I said, even more than a government candidate, I'm a big believer in the phrase, I'm from the government, I'm here to help, is maybe not the best, but I can tell you as a Catholic and as a Christian, this is something that's close to my heart. So I would love to continue to talk with you and work with you. And by the way, Joel, you have a great sense of humor. I was reading through one of your emails and I got a couple good chuckles out of it. So
Thank
you.
you, Andrew. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care. So again, we are waiting for Rob Astorino. I'm sure he'll be joining us shortly. So we definitely have a spectrum of candidates, don't we, to choose from, Errol?
Oh, for sure. Oh, yeah, for sure. Oh, look, there are, it's really striking how, if you think about it, with one exception, you and I have talked about this, Susan, there's been a Cuomo on the ballot for statewide office every cycle since the late 1970s, with one exception, I think in 1998. So we're really at the end of a super cycle, if you want to put it that way. That we've had two generations of Cuomos, and it's a particular way of looking at government. It's a particular way of looking at hunger, poverty, the economy, Albany itself. And so, what I'm finding tonight is that some of the questions are actually big questions that, we're going to have to try and figure out as a state, and certainly the hosts of the event are going to have to try and figure out a new way of doing business.
Yeah.
In a brand new Albany.
Yeah, the issue that you brought up, I think it was with Jumani, about the difference between charitable and retail food is a really big question, because they work together. Food stamps, rather SNAP, and the food banks. Everybody works together to make sure everybody is fed. But at the end of the day, people, there's a stigma attached to everything here. And so it depends on, people need to feel comfortable with how they're getting food. Oh, I'm losing my battery. I have to plug this in. Excuse me.
I hear you, Susan. The question, I think, is a very good one, because we have a system, if you want to call it that, where all of the heavy lifting is done at the policy level, right? This is something I've just learned over the years from dealing with the organizations represented here, that there is no substitute for SNAP. That you can have all of the the best, most dedicated, most efficient pantries and soup kitchens imaginable, and you're still only getting a fraction done of what one change in policy can do if you move the minimum wage or you move the benefit levels, in some kind of a significant way. So, I think we're going to have to educate a lot of these candidates about that. I think the last candidate was a literal example of that. We got to bring them up to speed. They're moving around looking for votes. They're not, and they're looking for policies that make sense, but they're not really doing deep dives into what's really going on in Rochester or Buffalo or the Bronx or any place, really.
Yeah, no, and an issue like hunger and poverty, these are very dense issues. I was talking to Molly Nickel, who runs the food bank of Northeastern New York, and she was helping me prepare some of the questions that we're asking tonight. And some of the, I mean, you know, they're so complicated. The issue is so dense that it's hard to even wrap your mind around it. And we're journalists, that's our job. And for these, for candidates who haven't been immersed in these issues, it must be daunting for them. I would love to see more candidates, though, spending time with these issues, because they really are the critical ones, and hunger does not have a lobbyist in Albany. I really feel strongly that it's up to us to make sure that hunger has a voice, and that we ask the candidates about these issues and poverty as well.
Right. Well, I mean, but you know, even that, right? I mean, normally the way the silos work in Albany and everywhere else, even at the county and the local level, is that there are anti-poverty programs and there are anti-hunger programs, and they're serving the same people, but they're led differently.
And there's
they're funded differently.
Absolutely, the money comes from different pots, and they don't speak to each other. It's definitely, you know, if we just got together with Joel and some of the people here, we could probably figure out some strategies to streamline this, but that's for another program. Again, we're waiting for Rob Astorino. He is a former Westchester County executive, previously served on the Mount Pleasant Board of Education, spent his life in Westchester County. He's also a radio guy. I think he worked for ESPN Sports, perhaps, and with Michael Kay. Are you a sports guy, Earl?
I am not, but I am a radio guy. And he worked in ESPN at ESPN for a while, and has hosted shows and so forth, and is a very good broadcaster. He's, you know, as we'll see when we talk with him, he's got a very good style that works well. Not my job to compliment any of the candidates, but he is a very good, he's a good broadcaster, good communicator.
Yeah, no, he's definitely a very good communicator, and I believe he's joining us now. Rob Astorino, yes, there you are. How are you?
Hey, Susan. Hey, Errol, what's happening?
Hey, good to see you. I, in part because I grew up in Westchester, I was just explaining a little bit about your broadcast background. As we said, he's the former Westchester County executive. Rob Astorino did serve on the Mount Pleasant Board of Education, the Mount Pleasant Town Board, and was a member of the Westchester County Board of Legislators. He is running for the second time for governor. He was the Republican nominee a couple of cycles ago, and he's decided to join us, and we're grateful to have him. And Rob, what we're asking each candidate to do is start by briefly describing the work that you do and the approach that you would take in dealing with questions of hunger and poverty across New York State.
Okay. Well, first of all, just for the whole meeting, you can see over my head my name, so you'll never forget it. I served as Westchester County executive for 8 years. Westchester is a pretty interesting county. It's 1 million people. Most people at first glance, certainly around the country, think it's a very wealthy county. It does have a lot of affluence, but it also is a very diverse county in so many different ways. And we've got urban areas, we've got the suburban feel, we've got the rural areas. So it is very diverse in its makeup. And with that comes a lot of issues that people don't associate Westchester with, including hunger and food insecurity. And it's something that we had to grapple with for 8 years, because when I first became county executive, we had a huge deficit, and taxes were the number one issue, where even a lot of Democrats voted for me in a county that is very Democratic. So we had to deal with a lot of issues. We had to balance a budget, and we had social services. Our biggest department was the one department in my budget in my 8 years where we actually added money overall. And it was because of the big need that we had throughout my 8 years, where we had the recession, in 2010 and 11, some of those difficult years we were coming out of. And we're kind of dealing with a lot of that now with, coming out of COVID. and inflation and the economy where people are struggling, homelessness. So food insecurity was a big issue. I dealt with Food Bank of Westchester, attended almost all of their events. We had a really good working relationship. And we actually did some innovative things in the county. We had a food digester pilot program that we did, where we took food waste and actually put it in this big machine. And then we used that to create food gardens. And we did that at our county jail. And it was a wonderful program. We also did a pilot program, which we expanded, where we worked with restaurants, institutions, and captured on a daily basis meals that otherwise would have been thrown out that were perfectly good meals still, whether they were prepackaged or meals that were cooked. But instead of going into the garbage, they were actually collected, and we brought them to homeless shelters, places that needed the food. And Food Bank of Westchester was something that grew tremendously in my time there. They were actually revamped. The warehouse there is enormous. And I think it was 1 out of every 5 people in Westchester had food insecurity, which is not something people would associate Westchester with, but it is and has been a big issue.
Okay. After Hurricane Sandy, while you were Westchester County Executive, you encouraged county residents to apply for federally funded disaster SNAP benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think those kind of benefits should be equally available to people who are facing poverty in situations that are, from their point of view, a disaster, but not necessarily natural disaster?
Yeah, I would take it on a universal level too. I think you hit the word that is part of food insecurity. We shouldn't necessarily just say there's hunger or food insecurity. It stems from poverty. It stems from a lack of housing. It stems from an inability to have employment and move up. And so the cost of living in New York is so expensive that people find themselves slipping backwards and into or out of whether it's poverty, unemployment, situations in their life that brings them to a difficult time, and going with that becomes hunger or food insecurity. So yeah, we wanted to make sure that supplemental nutrition assistance programs were available for people who needed it. We worked, and it's something that my family and I have done for many years. And I tried to do it to highlight it as county executive, just because the attention it can bring to get other people to volunteer. But we would volunteer, and there's something we wanted our kids to learn too, to help. And that, they're, in the grand scheme of things, they're pretty lucky. And, we want them to know that there's people who aren't as lucky. So we would always volunteer at shelters to distribute food. My son and I went to Peru on a father-son mission trip where we actually, worked with, we built houses, but we worked with and saw the most extreme poverty that you can imagine. So it's something that everyone should be exposed to and understand is right around us in our communities, whether they're the most affluent communities in Westchester or New York or elsewhere. But I think one thing we got to be careful about too is what we don't want is for generational poverty. What we don't want is for people to always need SNAP or meals. We want them to actually climb out of this and be in a stable household, stable environment, stable employment, and to move ahead. So the goal should be they don't need government assistance or charitable assistance.
Sometimes people do, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. When he was president, Donald Trump proposed slashing federal SNAP benefits, which would have also decreased the number of children receiving school free lunch at school. Would you agree with that proposal? And to that point, do you support universal school meals for public school children?
Again, this is where we might differ, or I might differ philosophically with some. The more we do universal everything, the more expensive it is, and it just becomes that cycle. So I do think there is a need, and I do think that there is sometimes a need in people's lives, but the goal should be to not stay with that need. The goal should not be to never want to get out of it. One of the things that we did in our social services department, which was nationally recognized, it was a pilot program. One thing that I had really in discussions with people who were on public benefits or who were falling back in arrears in child support, let's say, and we had what I thought was a really very well-received program and much needed program, and that was a fatherhood initiative. You know, under every study imaginable, if a father is not present, especially in their children's lives, the likelihood grows exponentially that those kids are going to end up either in poverty, not go to college, just fall behind in every aspect in life as they go forward. But what we found was the fathers wanted, and many times wanted, to get back into the lives of their kids. And by the way, the single moms were now shouldering the entire burden. But they fell into this trap where if they did gainfully get employed, oftentimes they would fall backwards on income and not be able to afford it. And staying on welfare or the benefits was economically advantageous. That is not what we should be striving for. Just to have a social safety net that will hold everybody at all times is not what the goal should be. The goal should be, it should be there to catch people, but eventually get them back into stability. So universal, I don't generally favor universal all the time for everybody. I think that leads to eventually unaffordability. And
what about
again,
cutting federal SNAP benefits?
What's that? Well,
Cutting.
I'm not going to say that I understand where the benefit levels are right now. I know they're constantly being expanded, and the more we expand, the greater the amount of people that are going to be on it. And once people are on it, it's hard to get them off it. And I think that's one trap we can't fall into.
Didn't COVID though really make the social safety net pretty leaky? And at least for the time being, we need to help people with SNAP and WIC.
Yeah.
And like
Oh
that.
yeah. But I think what you said was right. Time being, if we do universal, that's forever. And
我们如果做永久性的话，那是永久的，我们这个是没有办法的，我们只可以做暂时性的，来帮助食物方面的问题。
As least amount of people as possible on it forever.
我们只能占那一些有需要的人在上面，不可以让全部的人都在这个食物方面的补助。
That's the one area I had some friction when I first got into office, because it was always, and again, I was trying to balance. It was always about trying to balance what we could afford and what we needed. And I think those are,
我们想有一个平衡，就是说什么是需要，什么是应该给的。
So accountability within social services, but also making sure that people who were eligible and needed got on what they did, what they were able to get for benefits. We wanted to make sure, especially those in broken households, single moms and children.
我们希望在有这方面需要的家庭，个人方面，我们希望可以帮到这些有需要的人。
Rob, are what the sociologists would call moral hazard, meaning you give people something and then you sort of run the risk that they're going to remain dependent.
这个在社会方面呢是有一个特别的专词。
On the other hand, we have a provision of the state constitution, Article 17, requires the state of New York to provide for the aid and care of the needy. There's also the reality that the basic public assistance grant has not increased over the last decade. I think the upstate number, Albany County, the maximum benefit level is $367 a month for a single individual, and up to $698 a month for a household of 3 that has kids involved. Do you think that that's too high, or that's enough to keep people in permanent dependency?
No, I mean, honestly, given the cost of living and the lack of housing and support services, obviously that's not going to be enough generally speaking, for people, right? So wouldn't it be better to have less people who can actually move up the ladder and move them up there, and
我们
have
希望帮助有需要的人，可以帮助他们在这方面是有需要的这些人。
But that's why I think programs that are universal that will start.
所以我觉得全方面帮助的话，就是这样子的话，不可以帮助全部的人。然后它会反而有反效果。
I mean, obviously, you know, for a family of 4.
那当然，一家4口。
Children trying to get by on a couple $100 is not going to work. It never will work.
Another way to help people living in poverty is by increasing the minimum wage. And currently the minimum wage is $15 an hour in some parts of the state, as you know, but even that isn't really enough to accommodate for inflation, according to some of the experts on this program. So there's a push now to increase the minimum wage to $18 an hour. Is that something that you would support?
No. Look, people need to, and by the way, most, and the study
刚
shows.
刚问了，就是说想要把每个钟的时钟的价钱提高到18块，在纽约。然后他说，Rob 说他不支持。
Yes, there are people trying to get by on minimum wage jobs, but the goal is to get them trained and moved up to better opportunities. We could go on and on and on. I mean, what's the
我们
number?
可以一直在这方面一直讲下去。
Which will become 30, and you've got
What
small
if we pegged
businesses
it to
now.
inflation?
Well, but inflation is a matter of in many ways government spending, which is, you know, you're now chasing the tail, and it'll just spiral. So you can't. What good is a minimum wage job if you can't get a job? And I can tell you, you know, what was about 30% of the small businesses are now permanently out of business, you know, after COVID.
然后特别是 COVID 之后，有一些生意它都关掉了，他们现在请不到人做工。
Makes the profit margins and ultimately businesses.
你15块钱一个钟的话，你作为一个店主，你挣不到多少钱。然后你再算纽约其他的这些经济方面的用途，就钱加起来根本不够用。
Why don't we just do $25 or $100 an hour? I mean, you know, that'll make it a lot easier for people receiving, but nobody's going to be able to afford to pay those salaries. So we won't have those businesses. So again, to me, everything has to be balanced out. And it is extraordinarily hard for businesses, especially smaller businesses, to do business in New York. And that will make it even worse.
Errol?
To the extent that we're shrinking the size of government the way you're describing and cutting taxes, which you and some other candidates have called for, doesn't that reduce state revenue? And wouldn't that then translate into programs being cut that are supposed to be helping low-income New Yorkers?
Well, let's start with $400 million to Hollywood. Is that a necessary program? I mean, there's in a budget as huge as New York's and even as big as Westchester's, there was a lot of money to look at. You know, so I went all 8 years. I inherited a budget of $1.8 billion. I left 8 years later with a $1.8 billion. But as I said at the beginning, along the way, we
8年之间，我有1.8亿元的花费。
We did that because we were able to reduce the workforce through attrition, reorganize, and look at the programs that were working and didn't work. I'm all for spending money if it's done the right way and for the right reasons. I'm not in this to just throw away money or to keep giving money with no accountability. And unfortunately, you know, in government, things just chug along and nothing ever gets stopped or slowed down or questioned. And that comes at the expense of something. So I would rather spend $100 knowing it's going to people who actually need it than be
我情
spending
愿给100块钱给一些有需要的人。
for government employees and all the other things that go along with it. So, you know, but
与
I
其
didn't
给一些不需要的人。
what my job was after I left county executive. So I had two jobs mainly. One was to be the Republican pinata on CNN, which was actually fun. I saw Errol over there plenty of times. It was actually fun to do, but I was the the Republican on the air at CNN. But the other thing, and my main job during that time, Cardinal Dolan hired me to work directly for him and to help launch the Mother Cabrini Health Foundation. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, it is a multi-billion-dollar nonprofit organization that is not affiliated with the Archdiocese of New York, but it is has a board that is appointed by the bishops. And it falls under the charities law of New York State, so it's overseen by the Attorney General's office. The purpose of that, the sole purpose of that, is to spend down the $3 billion that they have, and hopefully, they'll have that for a long time with their investments, but to spend money to give to nonprofits and others on, there were 8 categories, but food insecurity and hunger programs was right up there. And these are the eligible programs, helping those previously incarcerated, new immigrants. These are the programs that I actually worked on for 2 years in developing and
在
also
2年里面，我帮助过跟食物方面有关的项目，还有就是去过监牢，出来监牢之后要找工的人。
and their affiliates, but others went to nonprofit organizations. It was Catholic and non-Catholic, and it was, it was great. And I also got to see different things that I wasn't really able to see as county executive. And I worked.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it was interesting, and it was for a great cause. And so I absolutely believe in it. I just believe that it should be done the right way. And I've seen the worst of it in how it gets abused and misused and wasted, and so often with government. But I also see how it goes directly into the hands of people who desperately need help as well, and how it could be done the right way.
Well, Rob Astorino, former Westchester County executive and gubernatorial candidate, thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate the opportunity. Good to see you both. I see all these names on the board. It's nice.
谢谢你参加我们这个节目，我很高兴、很荣幸可以参加这个项目。今年将会是一个很有趣的一年。在选举的路子上面见你。再见，晚安。
A full video of this event will be available at youtube.com/hungerfreeamerica. And Errol, I think that's it.
Okay, thanks very much for a great discussion.
Thank you.
今晚的这个节目会在 YouTube 上面播出来1个钟头。